All right, so in the spirit of the other talks today, I think is this sort of on-the-fly presentations. So this is a little bit of an experiment. It's an idea that I've been kind of refining for myself as a reflection of the growth of the company and my own work for the last number of years. It's not something that I think about night and day, but certainly from time to time reflect on. And I think putting together these presentations, these talks, help me focus a little bit on this topic. So what I'm going to talk about in sort of loose terms is process, but really the antithesis of process. And I think good, it works. The best way to kind of start off is a little reflection in terms of my relationship with process. I left school. I was an engineering student in the Midwest of the United States, and I left school back in 1995, about 9 years later after this photograph was taken. So the photograph is somewhat irrelevant, but that is me. And so I left school and left the engineering world to focus on something that caught my attention and was more interesting, which was the web. And I'd moved to Chicago and worked at a firm, basically a product service firm that was 12 people. It was really, really small. We had no process. We had just our way of working. We each, as individuals, brought our own sort of perspective to the work. We also brought, I suppose at some level, our own methodology, set of tools that we used to create our work. And it was very early days, so everything was kind of an experiment. Back then, much like startups, everybody does everything. And in those days, I was a designer, developer, information architect, and it was sort of an interesting heyday. And shortly thereafter, probably about 2 years after joining this firm, we got acquired. This is always a sort of a fun period. We had gotten acquired by a much larger firm. So we moved from 12 people to 2,000 people with offices internationally. And it was an interesting reflection for me in thinking about that transition, because that transition was also a lot about being professional, because you're working for bigger clients that had presumably bigger risks. Maybe the risk was hiring us, I don't know. But what was interesting to me was this idea of process, and I really became interested in process and in formalizing the way that I work. Did that better the end product that I was creating? And years later, so I spent about 10 years at that company, bounced around from Asia to Europe to the US, and worked on a number of different teams. And again, speaking about this relationship with process, what I always found interesting was the company would sort of market itself around its process, and this is a very typical thing in large agency work. Is we have this very diligent process. You can trust us, you can respect us, and yet the reality was day to day or month to month or really project to project, that process, that way that we worked, was reinvented every single bloody time. There was no consistency. Other than maybe the moniker in our business cards. So what I started to think about was how process was really kind of this fallacy, at least within the concept of creating things, inventing things, or reinventing things. So now we'll sort of fast forward a number of years and get through all that and talk about this sort of next phase of my life. I left that agency, went to go start a small studio, and the intent there was, again, kind of getting back to my roots of the relationships and, I suppose, method of working that I missed in the 12-person company. So we'll go through this sort of dissection, if you will, and timeline of how we evolved and are, I suppose, still evolving in terms of how we work. So we'll kind of go through a little history lesson of Kickstarter. Quick interruption. How many people even know what Kickstarter is? Is that? Okay, cool. All right. I don't need to explain that. That's good. All right, so in 2002, Perry, who's my co-founder, the guy who had the idea, He had said idea in 2002 when he was living in New Orleans. He later moved back to New York, where he grew up, and was waiting tables at a restaurant in Brooklyn. Ended up befriending one of his customers by the name of Yancey, and they formed a bond. Right? They become friends first, and eventually, as the relationship between those two grew, Perry kind of divulged this idea that he had. And that's sort of the very early Genesis days, if you will, of Kickstarter. Certainly a lot happened in those 4 years prior, but really I think the rubber hit the road probably when Perry met Yancey. A year later, Perry meets me. And how Perry met me is also kind of interesting in terms of where this sort of idea is going to go today. Perry met me through an old colleague of mine, somebody that I worked with back in the days of the 12-person company, somebody that I had a very close relationship with that turned out to be Perry's roommate in college. So they too had a very close relationship. I'd assume it had a lot to do with drinking and partying and that kind of stuff. And so there are these bonds that were forming. These relationships were incredibly important. These relationships that were effectively built on trust. So we'll get to the other part later. But what I want to focus on now is this very intense period of time of sort of invention, where Perry, Yancey, and I, and the crew that was working with us on building this thing, it was an intense time, but it was also kind of a long period of time. It was sort of atypical, I think, of what the scriptures say startups should be going to market in. But that be as it may, it was a long time. So, the interesting thing in sort of speaking about how my relationship with Perry grew, we weren't necessarily friends first, but we had this connection. And what we did early on in the first, say, 3 or 4 weeks of working together, and I was sort of building this studio up. What we had started doing was just sort of working on the side. It was like another project for me, and I was working for free because I was interested, and I was trying to help a friend's friend out. And what we had done over that period of time, there was no sort of financial transaction. It was purely about, hey, I'm interested in the thesis of your idea. It connects very, very deeply for me in terms of other things that I've done in the past. And so we got to know one another. And it was only after that relationship was built that I came on board as a co-founder. So he needed to have some level of faith in me that I could execute and process the way that was comfortable for him, whether that was antithetical to how he thought about things as a challenge or in concert. So as we sort of formed a team, there's sort of an interesting thing. You see that so this is America. So New York is over here where you see Yancey and Perry. I'm in Chicago. I started out in New York. This is not a recommended thing, but about 6 months after meeting Perry, I moved to San Francisco. So when you're starting a company, moving to the other side of the country, kind of awkward. And then I had a kid, and my wife and I moved to Chicago. That's on a startup salary of 0. You have in-laws, free babysitters. You sort of make sacrifices. So I left the Bay Area. So this was the team that effectively built the original site. Perry and Yancey in New York, me in Chicago. Lance, who's one of our lead engineers, was out in Walla Walla, Washington. I always love that. Carson was a developer down in Houston, and Mike was down in Florida. And so we lived on Skype. Thank God for Skype. And aren't they up here? Yeah, great. Usually don't think about that, but anyway, so it was an interesting time, and this sort of same process that Perry and I went through. We went through in great detail with everybody else that came on, and since these early days. So with Lance and Carson and Mike, it was very much the same thing. Who are these guys, and what do they bring to the table, and do we have faith in their ability to sort of make decisions and take the general ethos of how we operate? So, right, there's this process, so to speak, of thinking through problems. And I think the thing that, again, kind of going back to the issue that I have with process, or my observations around process, is what process doesn't really solve is these problems around unraveling these massive hairballs, these problems around intellectual problems or social problems that then get translated into a functional product. And what that basically comes down to is the ability, creating an environment that provides an ability to think, right, and think, say, outside the box. So what I noticed is as the company was growing larger, as we moved from everybody being distributed, we're now literally everybody is in New York and the Lower East Side. That was certainly an interesting transition. But I think as we started getting bigger, you start thinking about things like process. How do we formalize the methods by which we work? And what I realized, and Perry, Yancey, and I would always talk about this, what I realized was how do we capture that sort of interesting moment when we were a startup before launch, when we were kicking around this idea and really beating each other up in terms of what this thing's going to be and how, and that level of diligence. So we're now 45 in New York, like I said, 45 I think as of the end of, or middle of next month. We're projecting a little bit, we have some hires that are starting late. And so the world's starting to change, and this isn't like an instant at the gate thing. We've been out for 3.5 years, and this has been sort of a progressive, very organic process of hiring people and bringing them sort of into the family. Certainly a much bigger family than the 12 people that I had sort of aspired to go back to, but a family nonetheless. So this is actually our office over here, that crappy door, sort of entertaining. We're upstairs. There's a bar over here. And so we launched in 09, and now we're sort of at this point of 40 people, and there's all three of these people are people that have started probably in the last year and a half. And what's interesting there is thinking again about sort of delegation or ownership. We start bringing more people on. We're bringing them on to extend the work, right? In some cases, it's about doing better work. All of my designers I've hired are much better designers than myself, and so that's in an effort to make the product better. And the other side is really thinking in terms of the delegation piece, which is ownership. Do these people, these talented people, can they think, and do they have a sort of point of view that is, in some case, similar to ours? Do they understand the mission of the company? Do they have purpose and passion around the objective that we're trying to follow? All right. So that gets into this sort of point of what we hold dear. What are the things that we want to capture and really kind of communicate to each individual that comes on board? So for one, we've long had this idea of keeping the team small, or at least feel right. Like I said, we're larger than I had sort of projected that we would have been, or at least when I was going to start my other company, how big I wanted that firm to be. And so stay small is sort of a relative term, I suppose. Be efficient and effective, and I think this is an interesting sort of yin and yang or balance, maybe playing off of Tom's balance beam earlier. But efficiency kind of has this very kind of German appeal to it, right? And it's not about engineering per se. It's not about that level of efficiency all the time, but it is about thinking through how we can do a better job, how we can shortcut the process to get to that idea better, but also about being effective. Are we holistically thinking about the problem better? And so that is sort of a bit of a yin and yang in terms of one wants to get to the end goal quickly and the other one wants to get to the end goal correctly. The other piece which really goes back to those early days when Perry and I were sort of banging our heads against one another. It's very much how I think that works, which is around this idea of insight and curiosity. We're constantly curious about the thing that we were working on and debating. We had significant debate around each decision that we made. And that that intensity, that sort of same level of curiosity and challenge exists today in the company at 45. And this is probably the biggest thing for us as a platform for creative projects, as we call it. Our roots are incredibly important to us. It defines who we are as individuals, as three founders coming from the arts. Perry, as much as he worked at a restaurant, he also owned an art gallery in Brooklyn, and he was a musician. I've been involved in music and am a designer. And Yancey's a writer and a rock critic, and he's very involved in the music scene. So all of us really had this same purpose, the same intent, the same background, the same language that we spoke. And that language is so critical to how we think about ourselves or the brand of the company as a reflection of us. And same for everybody on the team. So our roots really mattered in terms of people who had a desire to make something. And then the last thing was just this retaining this idea of play. I think one of the things that was so great about those early days was, we didn't have a timeline. We didn't have a Gantt chart that got us from 0 to 100 miles an hour in the 6 months that we should have done it in. We honed what it was that we were creating over a much longer period of time. There were pragmatic reasons as to why that time period dragged on as long as it did, but it allowed us that time to kind of continually reflect and continually iterate on the product that we were to launch in the future. All right, so the sort of comparative between process and methodology is something that I've been interested in for a number of years, and you'll hear a bit of anti-process in a minute, but also this idea of what methodology is and how it is different than process. So this is kind of a fun little IKEA. Anyone put anything together from IKEA? Kind of feels like this and looks like this, right? It's pretty terrible. The thing that I found interesting about process is, so process, it's not to say that process doesn't work. So this linear trajectory of how things operate works very well when you're trying to get factory workers to build a car in the most efficient way. When you're trying to build a repetitive widget, it works very well in that case. If you're trying to perfect something in that respect, keep things consistent. And ultimately, what I sort of realize is everything that we all do every day is not about making cars, right? It's not about taking something and repeating it. It's about reinventing it every single day, whether it's you just put a feature out or a new product set out. Your job is to reflect on that thing that you've created and really come to it from a holistic perspective. And not even really from a product perspective, but almost more from a perspective of human nature. And I think if we get into this rigor of this linearity of what's going on or how we should focus on doing something, we lose sight of our ability to sort of think broader. And so I'll start defining how I sort of approach this idea of methodology is essentially just a toolbox, a set of things that I have at my disposal. And there's no real order by which I use them. There is a method to using one or the other. There's a rationale for using one or the other. And so some of the things that we use, as I mentioned, Skype, email, we actually, it's interesting, now that we're all in one place, we still use email excessively. Like there might be 3 of us that are sitting on the same floor, and we'll have a thread in Gmail of like 95 messages. We could have probably just gotten up and talked, but we're busy, so email actually works pretty well. Skype, yeah, I don't use Skype anymore, sorry. But I think Martin and I use Skype to chat. That was nice. But yeah, and the amount of Skype that we've used now that we're all in one location doesn't matter, and that's actually a valid point. The context is important. So these are tools that we use. I'm not going to use Skype to talk to the guy who's sitting right next to me. But then thinking about things like interviews and field research, talking to customers, people who use Kickstarter, chatting with one another on the team, or quite honestly, just going out for a beer. Probably the best advice that I could give is just go have a beer with somebody and chat in that context. Get out of the office. And so for particular features that we're going to roll out or iterate on, we may just need analytics that might tell us just enough, and just enough to get a feature out and iterate from there. But maybe it's the analytics only give us a portion of insight, help us refine the questions, and we want a bit better sense of what the questions are, what the answer to those questions are, so we then go and do field research. So it's a bit of picking and choosing what are the right tools for the job. So I added, and we have these sort of Venn diagram threads in these talks. It's a conference, so how could you not? I added a fourth, and this is not bullshit. It's actually how we sort of operate in the company. We have a community team, and one of the things that I recognized, kind of going back a number of years in the agency consulting days, is the organization or the division or the silo. In most companies, large companies, that gets the least amount of attention is the customer support team, right? This is a team that is typically struggling to get attention, and yet they're the ones on the front line. They're the ones who are most innately connected to and need to talk to customers every single day, literally. And so we actually bring them into into the brainstorming discussions around features. Is this viable? How is the community going to react? And even just as a preface to like, hey, this thing's coming. Be aware. Play defensive is interesting. So I think enough has certainly been talked about the other three, but this is sort of a unique facet. So. This hairball idea, this idea that you've got to sort of unravel this thing and you need a team to sort of figure out how to do that, is a mess, right? Life is messy. This is a drawing that my kid put together, and I don't know what the hell it is, but it's kind of cute, right? And maybe there's something there. Maybe it's like the start of something, right? It's this sort of very messy moment. There's also these sort of like, can you see that? Right? There's a little nudity, right? This is my daughter and my sister. Life's a little unpredictable. And the reality is, so is work, right? Work should be messy, right? Our job is to make order of the mess, but innately it should be messy. Like messy desks, totally cool, I don't care. My desk is neat and clean because I need that for my own brain, but Daniela over here, her desk is a hovel, as far as I'm concerned. But it works for her, right? And so like, who am I to say? And so like, yeah, this is where Kickstarter is. And life, work is also unpredictable. You never know what, each feature that we put out, as much as we have a thesis and intent behind why we've put it out, it is an experiment. Kickstarter was an experiment. Everything that we're doing, and I think it's sort of been said a number of times today, is an experiment. Big or small, different levels of risk, but they're experiments. They're all social experiments. We didn't know where this thing was going to go. Twitter was totally an experiment. It started out as an SMS platform, which was really annoying, and then they turned it into something that was actually, well, you know what it is. So, Twitter. All right. So what this all sort of circles back to is this idea of trust, and it's not really this kind of trust, but it's more this kind of trust, right? That's Andrew, one of our designers, and that's Mike, one of our curators. And Andrew doesn't really dress like that often. It's just sort of a random day, but he got. I think his mom bought him a suit, so whatever. I think he wore that for like a month, every single day. Andrew's a character. And hey, they're drinking together, right? That's cool. This actually happened to be a kind of a crazy day where we had, I call it the sort of Kickstarter double rainbow day. We had 2 projects that hit $1 million, and we were sort of celebrating with them. And what Mike is doing essentially is we're just refreshing the page until one of the projects actually hit $1 million. So it was just sort of a fun day. But these relationships are critical, and I think the biggest thing with these hairball situations is ultimately that in these moments of uncertainty, in these moments of distress, where you're trying to figure something out and there might be opposing opinions, you do a lot of this, right? There's a bit of headbutting at times. And in those moments of stress, in those moments of duress, the only thing that you can really fall back on is your faith and trust in one another. It's how do you get through those things together objectively, not make it personal. Processing can help you with that. So I thought it would be worth actually taking a real definition of trust, and this is what Merriam-Webster says. It's a reliance on the character, ability, strength, and truth of someone or something. I define it as a fragile, ongoing, developing, and complex relationship between people and groups of people. It is ever-changing, right? As we add, in the early days, I always realized that, so Andrew was one of our very first hires. He started 2+ years ago at this point. And, I knew that Andrew, as an individual, he's the first designer that I hired and then would have to delegate work to. And I knew that he was going to have an incredible impact on the product and the general nature of Kickstarter. Fred, who was, I think, hire number 2, I think, officially, one of our data analysts and engineers, he has an incredible impact in terms of just his own character as an individual in how we think about Kickstarter. And it's interesting, it becomes less and less of an impact, I suppose, as you grow larger and larger and become a more, say, homogenous organization. But in those early days between that 0 to 5, 0 to 7, 0 to 12, 0 to 25, there are these very, very precious moments where just one person has a massive impact. So what is all this? It's a bit of, I suppose, who we are and really a reflection or a constant reflection of how are we doing? Are we doing a good enough job? And it's not to say that process is an all-out evil thing. Like, we certainly have little sort of micro processes in the organization, ways that we make ourselves a little bit more efficient. We push off things that are repetitive. But they usually are sort of operational things, whether it be in the code base or whether it be in the CSS or or our style guide. Like, those are things that allow us as designers or developers to focus on the task at hand, which is really solving the problem at hand with the particular feature, not worry about the consistency issues, let's say, on the site. Those are the things that we'd like to institutionalize. So this is a bit of Kickstarter. Bit of a mess at times. This is probably 9 o'clock in the morning because there's not that many people here. This is the company. That's Yancey in the middle with the glasses and Perry in the red shirt. Fred over there with the camera who actually took the photograph. And yeah, this is our little space. We're one big, I suppose now, 45-person family, maybe kind of big. And this is actually an important note. So, one of the things that we also hold very dear is I think I mentioned earlier, the idea of our roots, right? Where we come from as makers, as creators of things, as artists and such. And we have this and we find it very interesting with the platform that we have this very special opportunity to have a relationship with the people that use the site. And so this is Amanda Palmer. She is a musician out of New York, and these are actually, so they're sort of carrying her along. I believe this was the day that her project ended, and she wanted to throw a party and sort of celebrate like the countdown, which was kind of this epic thing. And these are all her backers. So she posted an update and got everybody together, and it became this very visceral experience, a piece of history, a piece of memory for her and everybody else. And what I thought was kind of entertaining, I just literally found this photo on my hard drive today. What I thought was interesting about this was the camaraderie that this represents, right? And the fact that we were there, right? We have this. We do really strive to have a relationship, and in many ways Kickstarter is about that relationship between individuals, very sort of emotional relationships between people. We really strive to reflect on that and think about that as sort of a very critical part of our soul, if you will. So in sort of conclusion, challenge this idea of process in favor of making things, in favor of getting things out the door, but also getting things out the door that are right. Work towards this environment of mutual trust. It's not a two-way street. I've got to build trust with Andrew as much as he needs to build trust with me so I can let go. Hire curious people. Hire people that are constantly going to be thinking about and intellectually stimulated by the problems that we're trying to solve, I'm not looking for somebody that's just going to be an assembly line worker. I'm not looking for a pixel pusher. That is not interesting to me. Oh, and the big point, get out of the way, that's my job. So I want to leave with one last note. It's a little video that someone had posted on the site, and I think it really, to me, it's exciting, but I hope it's exciting or interesting to you guys. But it really reflects, at the end of the day, why are we doing this? We're doing this not for our own egos. We're doing this not for ourselves. We're not doing this for Kickstarter per se, but we're doing it for people who find success and achievement and progress through the site. So hopefully the audio is on.